It's really good to be here today, surrounded by people who care about other people no matter what. Currently, I am a reporter for the Economic Hardship Reporting Project, based in New York City as well as DC. I write about highly marginalized people experiencing tremendous amounts of economic duress. Many of those people are unhoused. Since my own emergence from a park bench on the outskirts of Salt Lake City, Utah, my stories have appeared in the New York Times, the Washington Post, MIT Technology Review, Mother Jones, and many other publications. Before my collapse into homelessness, my life was about success. I grew up in the tiny suburbs of Palo Alto, California. I went to one of the best high schools in the country at the time. When I was only 9 years old, my parents bought me a baby grand piano because they thought I had some musical talent. And at 11, I said, no, I want to be a ballerina. So they supported that, and I studied ballet on a regular basis and got good enough to be accepted into the San Francisco Ballet School. I even got to dance with them on the stage of the Metropolitan Opera House. My dad was an immigrant from Panama. He came here with very little, but he worked his way through college in Texas and then went on to become a microbiologist at NASA Ames Research Center. By the time he retired, he was overseeing space shuttle experiments. My mom was from this tiny town called Aberdeen, South Dakota. She did not graduate from college, but she had an extreme amount of determination, chutzpah, she used to say. And that took her with her skill set to Stanford University, where she worked in the anthropology department as an administrative assistant. As for me, I graduated from San Francisco State University with honors, and my career took me in journalism to the Syracuse newspapers, then the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, and then the Miami Herald, which at the time was in its heyday and winning tons of Pulitzer Prizes. I started out in a local insert, neighbors writing micro news about communities, and then during my 7-year tenure there, I finally arrived at this coveted position as an enterprise reporter on the features desk. And yet the indisputable fact remains that between November of 2014 and May of 2017, my home was on a park bench on the outskirts of Salt Lake City. A lot happened to bring me from the upper echelons of society to the absolute bottom ranks of society. I lost my business, an organic forestry business. I lost my 2 horses, Vashka and Raya. I lost my 4 dogs, my 2 cats. And in that hardship, at the worst of it, I was homeless and I was targeted. I was stalked. I was held hostage. And I was repeatedly sexually assaulted for a period of a year. And at the worst of that, I was institutionalized and incarcerated. So I don't want to talk about trauma from a theoretical perspective. I want to talk about it from a very personal perspective. You may be wondering, what brought her from here to here? You may be thinking, well, did she fall into the abyss of a drug addiction? And the answer is no. Okay, you may have heard of the many people that people talk about, the people that we think or have heard about that choose to be homeless. Maybe she was one of those. And the answer is a resounding no. Okay, so she mentioned mental illness. Was she mentally ill? I mean, she said institutionalization. So I'm going to answer that question, but just in a moment. First, I want to thank you for those thoughts, if they are indeed thoughts you might have been having, because these are the collective thoughts of most Americans. What we tend to do is project our assumptions onto the unhoused and put them into boxes so that we can relate to them and understand them. Heck, these were my thoughts as a Pulitzer-nominated journalist at the Miami Herald. And so that is why I want to talk about the critical need for trauma awareness in homelessness. Trauma is a Greek word that means wounding. So I said I would share some personal details. What did my wounding look like in homelessness? Well, for 815 days, I never got a good night's sleep. And sometimes that was because I was sleeping in a metal barracks in a homeless shelter, and at 2 o'clock or 3 o'clock or 4 o'clock, I would be awakened by my bunkmate who was vomiting her guts out in a trash bin a few feet away. Sometimes trauma, sleeplessness, and I bring this up because researchers, when they conduct their trials, they induce psychosis by not allowing people to sleep for more than between 48 and 72 hours. So put into context that I didn't get a good night's sleep for 815 days. So on the park bench, sometimes that looked like waking up at 2 o'clock, 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock, because I was so cold, even though I was swaddled in every layer of clothing that I had. And I was terrified that I was going to freeze to death. So I would walk around the outskirts of the park, warming my extremities. Sometimes trauma simply looked like sitting in a park surrounded by my belongings, which now fit into garbage bags, and noticing that the people who were walking by me would not look me in the eye. Sometimes trauma looked like going to the shelter and seeing human feces smeared on the tile walls in the bathroom, drug syringes strewn on the floor, and then deciding, okay, I'm going to go back to the park where there's a river and take a bath. Then trauma looked like being arrested for public lewdness, being put in a jail for 6 months. I'd never been in a jail before, in an 8 by 10 foot cell. And of course, trauma looked like the sexual assaults that occurred for at least a year. Sorry. Hopefully this keeps working. This may be my newest phone. We good? Yeah. Okay, so many world-renowned researchers have spent their professional lives studying trauma. One of my favorites is Besser Vander Kolk. He's a Boston psychiatrist, and he wrote the New York Times bestseller, The Body Keeps the Score. His research is not about anyone in particular, it's just about trauma in general and how it impacts the mind and the body of any human being, which I think is really interesting because trauma is the great equalizer. We are all constructed in ways in which our brains will react to trauma. And here's how he explains that. Quote, when the old brain takes over, it partially shuts down the higher brain, our conscious mind, and propels the body to run, hide, fight, or on occasion freeze. If the flight, fight, freeze response is successful and we escape the danger, we recover our internal equilibrium and gradually, quote, regain our senses. I'm sure we've all heard the term, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. But what if you can't regain your senses because you don't have a roof over your head, because you are being threatened, because you don't have a place to go to the bathroom, you don't have a place to sleep, and you're afraid you're going to die that night? How do you, quote, regain your senses? You don't. And so what happens, Besser Vander Kolk goes on to say, when you don't escape the dangers of, say, homelessness? Well, the brain continues to secrete the chemicals that then cause the body to employ the mechanisms that we call coping responses: flight, fight, and freeze. That is what the body does. It's not a frailty, it's a coping mechanism. My coping mechanism looked like curling up in a ball and repeating certain stanzas of prayers that I had learned over and over and over again. This was how I disassociated from the horror of homelessness. As it continued and there was no intervention, there was no housing, but there were continual sexual assaults, I stopped talking. I didn't say a word other than yes, no, and to give that police officer my social security number for 2 years. I also think that it's really important to understand that each of the 880,000 people currently estimated to be unhoused on any given night or day in this country, that not only is there the trauma of the homelessness, but there is the trauma that precedes the homelessness. So for me, that looked like a fire that completely ravaged the rental house where I was living with all my animals. And I ran out of that house to get the landlord, who was just a couple hundred feet away. She went into the house, and in her trauma, now the flames were licking the walls and the smoke was super thick and it was very dangerous. And in her trauma of seeing her rental property destroyed, she froze in front of the kitchen sink. And I was watching this from outside and worried she was going to die. So I ran into the flames, yanked her out of the fire, and unbeknownst to me, made myself very vulnerable to post-traumatic stress syndrome, which is the dysregulation of the nervous system. I may have regained my senses, except now what I call the great tsunami of trauma that had started with the fire continued with my mother's death. Maybe a couple of months later, of a terminal illness that no one knew she had. So I quickly watched her perish. And while that was happening, there were a lot of dysfunctional family dynamics going on over inheritance issues. Not only regarding my mom, but of my father, who had passed nearly 20 years ago. And in all this vengeful dysfunction, my family stopped talking to me. So I lost that safety net. I moved into a home of one of my customers. I had to leave because the state owned my mom's house in a reverse mortgage. So off I go to one of this customer's homes whom I barely knew, but I was desperate to keep my horses and my dogs and my cats with me. It's very hard, if not impossible, to find places to live with all those animals. So she lived on a 100-acre ranch, and off I went. At which point my dog was diagnosed with a terminal disease and started to die. And I, after working 8 years in a business without a day off, had no emotional reserves to cope with all this going on, and began to retreat. And in that retreat, was unable to keep up this horse treat business, and in that inability was unable to pay the rent, and I was asked to leave. So on the day that I left, I put my dog to sleep. I euthanized her. I stroked the manes of my horses one last time and left homeless. So as Professor Vanderpalt pointed out, unless the trauma is intercepted, it only escalates. And that's exactly what happened. So in the homeless shelter, within 2 weeks, maybe less, I went across the street to the homeless outreach center, where the man who was working behind the counter, John, decided that I looked vulnerable and he was going to prey on me. So he walked up to me, he gave a gentlemanly bow, and offered a pair of winter gloves. So it's December of 2014 in Salt Lake City. It's snowing. I don't have a coat. I don't have gloves. I accept. And then he says, let's go to breakfast. I'd like you to treat you to a warm meal. He works at the shelter. He's offering me breakfast. I walk to Denny's. And I still remember what I ate: scrambled eggs, hash browns, and sausages. And it was very fulfilling because I had not had a warm meal in 2 weeks. So then he escorted me back to the shelter, and I thought that was the end of that. Only it wasn't the end of that. The next morning, when I left the entryway of the shelter, there he was. And he followed me to the library, and he did this for a couple of weeks. And I have to say here, I'd never been hurt in my life. So naivete, like big time. Didn't know about stalking and grooming and predatory behavior. So one day, about a week into this, he says, will you go to the storage shed and I will give you my duffel bag because I see that your suitcase is the zippers are broken and your clothes are falling out onto the floor and I have an extra duffel bag. So I said, sure, okay. Went with him to the storage shed. Well, as soon as we got to the storage shed, he opened the door, the metal door, and handed me the duffel bag, and then got behind me and shoved me into the storage shed and shut the door. So I don't have a lot of recollection of what occurred. I remember him screaming at me. I remember him making me lie down on a bed of plastic. But what I do remember is when he opened the door, 3 days had passed. And I was absolutely terrified of this guy. And trauma, the thing that it does is it separates you from yourself. So I share these details with you not to have your sympathy. I don't want you to feel sorry for me. I share these details with you because I'm trying to help people see through the eyes of trauma awareness. A 2014 study from the American Journal of Public Health followed more than 300 women for 7 years and found that at least a third of them had suffered sexual assault in homelessness. My story is not unusual. Now, if we go back to those assumptions, right, that I talked about earlier, the assumptions of drug addict, crazy, lazy, but if we put on our trauma awareness lenses now, and you think about that man sitting under the overpass on a cardboard box, instead of the knee-jerk reaction of, why doesn't he get a job? With trauma awareness lenses on, there might be the thought, what coping mechanism is he stuck in? And drug addiction, which in trauma-aware terms is actually substance abuse. And while I didn't do drugs, I did disassociate from my body. And that is what substance abuse does. It allows a person to escape the hell of their situation, which there is no other way to escape. Gabor Mate, a New York Times bestseller and a Canadian physician, he wrote the book, When the Body Says No. And he says, okay, the question should not be why the drug addiction. If we are trauma aware, the question should be why the pain. Now, I said I would talk about mental illness. Okay. Thankfully, when I stepped away from the park bench, I was blessed to work with a trauma-aware therapist by the name of Jamie Bustamante. She was head of the clinic that worked primarily with people who had been through tons of trauma, and she was also, unbeknownst to me, connected to the hospital that had institutionalized me. And after about 6 months of working with me, she said, "You're not mentally ill, you're traumatized." And she went into my records and expunged them and replaced them with the appropriate diagnosis, which was PTSD. And I share this story not to say, okay, there is no mental illness in homelessness. I'm not saying that. I'm saying that with trauma-aware lens, mental illness, drug addiction, laziness is just changed completely. We have a whole new way of understanding people's coping mechanisms. And this is a really important thing to understand given the population of the unhoused. Who are the unhoused? In America, they're 40% Black. I'm sorry, 13% Black. That's the general population. But in homelessness, they're 40%. That's a big imbalance. And the systematic constructs that are racially imbalanced are going to flow into those constructs in homelessness, which is why, according to a 2019 Rutgers study, quote, there has been a tendency for clinicians to overemphasize the relevance of psychotic symptoms and overlook symptoms of major depression in African Americans compared with other racial groups. Okay, that's a lot of information, but this is my favorite part of the speech, and this is the part about healing the trauma in homelessness. So after that astounding story that I still cannot sometimes believe is mine, I stand before you a largely healed woman. Why? Because of housing. Honestly, 3 days after I walked away from that park bench, I wrote my first story out of homelessness for a publication called The Street News. You may have heard of it. It's now defunct, but it was something that unhoused people stood and sold for $1 or $2. That happened 3 days after I went to a temporary shelter where they kept me, gave me a nice warm bed. 3 months after being housed, I was approached by an editor from the Washington Post who I had worked with when I was at the Herald, and he offered to help me get a story into the Washington Post about my collapse and emergence from homelessness, and it sold. And after that, within a year, I was freelancing and in my own apartment. And that was a really lovely thing that still sometimes brings me to tears, because my trajectory was supposed to be death or a life as of institutionalization. It is an urgent time in America to focus ourselves on housing. We are in an affordable housing crisis in Asheville alone. Housing costs escalated by 20% in 1 year. As Cindy was saying, hundreds of people are waiting for homes. If I had had access to the project such as Homeward is now working on in refurbishing the hotel that will bring at least 85 people, a safe place to come into homeostasis and regain their senses and heal and then thrive, I am absolutely positive my life would have been altered for the better. Thank you.